Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We're Team 2, and we are Jake Berger, Nick Fiumara, Nick Karpchuk, Grace Woodruff, and Sheree Williams. I'll let you guess which one of those I am, but our presentation today for our marketing recommendation project is about women driving in Saudi Arabia. So before we get into this a little bit too far in depth, we're going to take a look at some of the background regarding Saudi Arabia in general, especially in relation to the United States. So one of the most major details you really need to know about the country is that it's a huge trade ally already with us. We dabble in a little bit of oil exchange, and they have diplomatic relations. They actually have a female representative from Saudi Arabia living in Washington, D.C., so that's always good to know, especially considering the topic of our case. Overall, the culture of the country is very masculine and patriarchal. The men tend to make most of the decisions in family life and business life, all that kind of stuff. And they really make up the most of the workforce, over 75%. We'll get into that a little bit later in specifics. And only recently, about the last 15 or so years, has there been actual development in the women starting to get some more rights. I'm sure you can kind of guess which one we're going to talk about here in a second. But there it's not normal for this kind of thing to really happen, especially given some of the real deep-rooted traditions of the culture, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So just a bit of background before we get going here. All right, now moving towards the issue of well, really the core issue of the project here. Um, as we see it, women are really, really extremely oppressed in Saudi Arabia, and a lot of the more common rights of just humans in general in most of the countries around the world really don't apply. And some to name off the top of our heads here that you'll see is that there's restrictions on travel internationally or just around the country itself. There's marriage selection, childcare selection, and all that kind of stuff. The right to divorce, even, or the solving of domestic violence disputes, and just choice of employment and healthcare choices. They're really only actually made by really men, and whoever is responsible for a woman really makes those decisions for them. So you really see how the culture is very, very different from a lot of the ones that, especially we are accustomed to here. So it's just something to really note that there's a lot of change that could really be made in this country. And overall, it's interesting to see some of the changes that have actually come about. So now, while there's plenty of changes that could be made, there is also plenty of justification that's made on behalf of Saudi Arabia itself. And a lot of the justification for these sort of rights that the men and women are granted in itself already comes from their Sharia law practices and just overall cultural traditions. If not, they are really derived from passages in the Quran text or just major tenets of the Islamic religion itself. So realistically, a lot of these cultural practices are very, very deep rooted in Saudi Arabian lifestyles and culture, going back as far as the country has really honestly been around. So it's not exactly easy to just up and change some of these rights and traditions. So that's kind of why there's really only these sort of baby steps being made now. And the one that we really picked for this case is such a monumental shift that it's just so important to really notice that these deep rooted traditions can change actually over time. So moving in towards a little bit of the economics and trade side of Saudi Arabia, the marketplace is actually going under a very extensive kind of reformation, and this comes along with what they like to call Vision 2030, which was implemented by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And Vision 2030 is just an overall, basically major overhaul of the entire country's international and domestic economic policies and really goals. And they have set hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of goals to really increase the overall well-being and financial prosperity of the country. And some of the major tenets and major parts of this really come down to the state-owned goods and services, and really industries are actually becoming privatized now, so people actually get to work in them that are not part of the government. And it's really beginning to prioritize social and cultural interaction within the market itself. So they really want everybody that is in Saudi Arabia to really have a voice and a stake in the market. And that's something that's really not been the case as of maybe the last 20 or so years. So real big changes are coming along the way. And this also comes with there's incentivizing to increase the household spending by 10%. And there's other goals of just overall prosperity individually as well as the country itself. So the market is growing and they have very, very ambitious goals to set. So it's a really interesting market to really observe and potentially enter here in the near future. So taking in consideration of all of the aforementioned real details here, there's plenty of opportunity in Saudi Arabia, and considering specifically that women were granted the right to drive in June of 2018, you really start to see that there's a lot of effects that are going to take place that just makes this an even better market adventure. So not only are they being allowed to drive, but this demonstrates a real huge transition in Saudi Arabian norms and traditions. And that in and of itself is just absolutely notable. And it's leading to plenty of ripple effects over the entire country itself. And one of the biggest effects that's kind of really come from this is you see that there's been a huge rise in the overall presence of women in the labor force. And at the end of 2018, that the labor force was comprised of about 22% of it being women, and the goal actually set by Vision 2030 was 30%. So by 2030, they want to raise that another 8%, and that's absolutely monumental, not only for the fact that women are now participating in the labor force, but it's creating more consumers as they begin to work more. So there's a huge amount of people that are not only looking to buy cars, but looking to spend money that are growing in the labor force as well. So it's very, very interesting to note as a market entry opportunity. Now, in regard to the overall equity or inequity, I guess, of the Saudi Arabian culture, you really are starting to see how women's roles in Saudi Arabia are really only now beginning to increase, and their freedoms are only beginning to do so as well. And overall, it's really, really interesting to see because so many parts of the world are already so really equitable in comparison to this country. And there's only so much that women are still allowed to do. And one of the most interesting parts of that is how women are really only allowed to work in specific private businesses. And most of them actually pertain to their individual or goods that are actually like pertain to them and themselves. So lingerie or feminine products, stuff like that. Women are really actually only the ones that are allowed to work there. Men are actually banned from working in those places. And that being said, there's actually still political backlash stemming from anybody that really wants to try the government and be active in, in seeking out more rights for these women and stuff. So there's a lot of equity and inequity that's kind of really at stake here, and it's really interesting to kind of see with just the legalization of driving. It's very simple, and it's a not too big of a thing you would think, but it's actually huge in terms of both rights and parts of the country. So taking in all of the previous information here, we really came across a couple of major recommendations. And the first one really consists of entering into private industries because a lot of those state-owned goods and services that are now becoming private, that's kind of a bit of a risky gamble to try to sneak into one of those kind of industries that are now transitioning to becoming private. So we really honestly want to recommend that you pick a private industry that really is private already, and furthermore segment even further by industry, maybe even separate it down to the durability of goods or a specific service if you offer multiple services and stuff like that. And then by doing so, you can actually segment and target even further by gender because there's just such a discrepancy between the two in the country. And honestly, one of the biggest ones that pertains to this project in general is utilizing these new rights that are starting to be given to women. And the overall change of allowing women to drive has done enough to really, really turn this market around and make it a huge opportunity for both automobile manufacturers and insurance service providers. That, and then in reflection of the labor force, now there's going to be even more consumers, and most of them are going to be women. So there's just almost limitless opportunity, and really advertising cater towards these increased rights and even pushing it further and increasing for more rights, maybe pushing the boundaries of international travel and stuff like that. There's more opportunity that can just lay itself out just by the passage of one law. So we really wanted to take those lessons that we learned from the passage of that one law, as well as all of the culture aspects, and just combine it into really these simple recommendations here. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to us today. And if you have any questions about Saudi Arabian culture or just any of the recommendations we made, we're more than happy to take them at this time. Thank you again.